put some numbers into perspective, some of the work that Stewart did, the Commission on Wartime Contracting, from 2002 to 2011, they made a conservative estimate that 31 billion to 60 billion of contracts were lost because of waste and fraud. And so that's how big of an issue this is, to make sure that we get this right. And what's even worse is that the Wartime Contracting Commission also found that the second largest source for insurgents in Afghanistan has been U.S. contracting dollars, our money. And so this, you know, we can, of course, being stewards of taxpayer dollars is so important, but what comes first? The protection of our troops. And this notion that we would somehow be allowing our dollars to go in the wrong hands, of course, I think would outrage everyone here. So one of the reasons for this situation was that our acquisition officials in Iraq and Afghanistan were operating under laws and regulations designed for contracting in the United States during peacetime, not in Baghdad or Bagram during wartime. And you can imagine where the situation is very different when you're contracting in the United States with a United States business, or even a foreign business when you're in the United States, as opposed to being in a wartime situation. So what happened is, once the Department of Defense officials, the military members on the ground, even the State Department officials, discovered that the U.S. contract was, the money was going in the wrong hands, it took way too long to terminate these types of contracts. And so this was something that I learned about when I came to the United States Senate. And I will tell you that I had the chance to work with Scott Brown when he was in the Senate in February of 2011. We teamed up and introduced what was called then no contracting with the enemy. And we worked to include key elements in our legislation into the defense authorization bill that was passed in 2012 and became law. And what happened as a result of the initial legislation that Senator Brown and I worked on, and what this legislation essentially did was to allow commanders to cut off contracting funds over a certain threshold much sooner and without the bureaucratic background that they'd have to follow if they were in the United States of America. And I'm glad to report that as a result of that legislation that got passed, Central Command was able to identify 4 Afghan vendors, 28 entities associated with these 4 vendors that have been engaged in hostile activities, resulting in the termination of 10 subcontracts with vendors and withholding of funds from 1 foreign prime contractor, and it has already resulted in saving $31 million. And that's just from the brief period that we got our legislation passed. So this was clearly a step in the right direction. In January of this year, I visited Afghanistan again and asked those on the ground, from Department of Defense, top general in charge of this area, and also asked USAID, State Department, how's it going? What's the progress? How are things going? And I was told that thank you for sending us the legislation. It's an important step forward. We've been able to cut some off, but it's not enough, and we need to do more. And as a result of that, Richard Blumenthal, who's a Democrat from Connecticut, was also on this trip with me. And his background is similar to mine. He was Attorney General of his state. So he and I had a lot of discussions from there. He also serves on the Armed Services Committee. And so what we did is we decided to introduce stronger legislation to also fill in the gaps, to give our commanders, but also the State Department and USAID, because the original legislation that we introduced only applied to the Department of Defense, did not apply to the State Department or USAID. And we now call our legislation that's pending, instead of no contracting with the enemy, never contracting with the enemy, which I think should be the standard we all should be aspiring to.